Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable and often forgotten fates of female pirates. These were women who defied their times, wore breeches, commandeered ships, and terrified the royal navies until they were caught. And that's when things got really interesting. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When your average pirate got caught. The script was simple trial rope applause from the crown and maybe a few spectators vomiting during the hanging. But when a pirate was captured, unmasked, and turned out to be a woman, the entire judicial system came screeching to a halt, like a drunk horse hitting a church wall. You see, the legal system of the 1600s and 1700s was perfectly efficient at executing men. Male pirates. Easy, hang them high, hang them fast, and hang them publicly enough to discourage the next guy with a cutlass and poor career planning. But female pirates, that wasn't in the playbook. There were rules for sheep theft, witchcraft, and marrying your cousin's cousin by accident, but nothing on what to do when the bloodthirsty marauder turned out to be wearing a corset or worse trousers. The discovery of a woman pirate caused a moral and bureaucratic meltdown. First, everyone in court would squint, blink several times, and then ask something intelligent like, "But where's her husband?" Because clearly, a woman couldn't possibly be choosing a life of crime on her own. It had to be some man's fault, or Satan's, or both. The judges would frantically flip through outdated law books looking for the section titled Lady Pirates and Other Inconvenient Anomalies, finding nothing they would debate. Is she mad, possessed, hysterical? Is this some kind of elaborate prank? Meanwhile, the accused woman would sit there calmly, probably with a smirk, knowing full well she'd gutted a few officers just last week. Now some courts did the expected thing. They sentenced her to hang, ideally before lunch. Others got cold feet. Maybe it was the publicity. Maybe it was the nagging fear of hanging someone who was both charming and heavily armed. Or maybe they just didn't want to explain to the archbishop why they executed a woman in trousers. And so female pirates often ended up in a strange limbo. Half criminal, half curiosity. Some got the rope, some got the cell, some got... Well, we'll get there. But one thing was certain. The courts weren't ready for women with swords opinions, and absolutely no time for legal confusion. Anne Bonny didn't scare easily. She was Irish, red-haired, violent, and deeply unimpressed by most men, including the ones sentencing her to death when she was finally captured. In 1720, the authorities in Jamaica expected her to burst into tears, beg for forgiveness, and maybe offer a touching monologue about knitting, or God. Instead, she offered sarcasm, standing in court beside her partner, in plunder, Mary Read. Anne listened politely to her death sentence. Then, in true Bonny fashion, she looked the judge in the eye and said, "If you'd fought like a man, you wouldn't be hanging like a dog." A bit rude. Yes, but at least she kept it nautical. Of course, Anne wasn't done, because Anne Bonny, pirate extraordinaire, had one more trick up her very piratey sleeve. She was pregnant, or said she was. No one asked for a midwife's note in 18th century British law. You couldn't execute a woman carrying a child. Something about divine mercy or not wanting to kill two birds with one rope. So Anne did what any clever woman staring down the gallows would do. She pled her belly, not her innocence. Her belly, and it worked. The court delayed the execution. It's unclear if Anne was actually pregnant or just pulling a fast one with a well-timed craving for mangoes. Some historians suggest it was true. Others think it was theatrical brilliance either way. Anne avoided the noose. While most of her male crew dangled like wind chimes in a hurricane, she was sent to prison, where she conveniently faded from official records. There are rumors, of course, that her rich father bought her release, that she started a new life, that she wore breeches until the end, and probably insulted everyone along the way. What's certain is, she didn't hang, which in pirate terms is basically retirement. Her case wasn't just unusual, it set a bizarre precedent. Suddenly, pirate trials became something out of an Elizabethan maternity ward. Female pirates began pleading pregnancy like it was a standard legal move. "I object, Your Honor, and also I'm with child Anne Bonny." Didn't just beat the system. She embarrassed it. She forced a courtroom to admit that sometimes piracy is less fatal when you know your reproductive rights. If Anne Bonny was fire, Mary Red was steel, stoic, blunt, and built like someone who could win an arm wrestling contest against Poseidon. Mary spent most of her pirate life dressed as a man and fighting like one too, which was inconveniently how she ended up in court, charged with piracy, and sentenced to hang right alongside Anne. Like Anne, Mary invoked the legal escape hatch of the 18th century pregnancy. She too pleaded her belly, which sounds like a bad stomach excuse, but was in fact the world's oldest get-out-of-gallows-free card. The court, unable to argue with biology, postponed her execution. But here's where Mary's story takes a cruel detour. Unlike Anne, who vanished mysteriously into legend or suburbia, Mary didn't get a second act while imprisoned in Jamaica's famously unhygienic and deeply unching prison cells. Mary fell ill, most likely from a combination of disease, pregnancy complications, and the general ambiance of rotting food and tropical despair. There's no record of her giving birth, just a quiet death in her cell, no epic escape, no last duel, no sarcastic courtroom zinger, just fever and a grim ending for one of piracy's toughest women history. It seems sometimes prefers its legend's half-finish. Some say she died from jail fever, possibly typhus or dysentery or some charming colonial blend of the two others. Suggest childbirth may have gone badly. Either way, the result was the same. No gallows, but no freedom either. Just another woman whose story ended in a forgotten cell while the men in wigs debated whether or not she was ladylike enough to hang her death was less dramatic than her life. But maybe that's the cruel symmetry of piracy, swashbuckling at sea, and silence on land. What Mary Red left behind wasn't a treasure map or a legacy of violence, but a quiet reminder that even the fiercest pirates could still be undone by something as ordinary as disease and bureaucracy. While Anoni and Mary Red became legends in the Caribbean, halfway across the world, a woman named Ching Shur was playing piracy on hard mode, and winning Ching Shur didn't command a sloop or a gang of 30 rowdy drunkards. No, she commanded an entire armada at her peak. In the early 19th century, she led over 300 ships and somewhere between 20,000 and 80,000 pirates, depending on whether your source is a historian or someone trying to impress a date. She wasn't just a pirate queen. She was a floating tax-evading empire. And unlike Bonny and Reed, Ching Shur wasn't captured because she had the audacity and the intelligence not to be as the Chinese Navy, Portuguese ships, and even British forces tried and failed to shut her down. Ching Shur made a wild move. She negotiated with everyone at once. She marched herself right into the governor's office in Guangdong, calmly laid out terms, and somehow convinced the Chinese government to pardon her all her pirates and even let her keep the loot. That's right, she retired with her dignity, her money, and her head intact. Imagine Captain Jack Sparrow, walking into Parliament saying, "I quit," and then being handed a pension and a business license. That's essentially what happened after retirement. She opened a gambling house because, of course she did. It's hard to return to knitting after running a maritime mafia. Now technically, Ching Shir was never captured, so she doesn't fit the usual narrative. But her story matters because she proved that being a woman pirate didn't have to end in execution or tragic obscurity. Sometimes it ended in strategy, survival, and smug retirement. Governments didn't know what to do with female pirates like her, not because she broke the rules, but because she rewrote them. She wasn't swinging from ropes or playing courtroom drama. She was running logistics, organizing supply chains, and executing power moves that made warlords nervous. Ching Shir didn't just avoid punishment. She negotiated her way out of it and walked away. Richer than most of the men who ever tried to catch her in most courtrooms of the 18th century. If you were a pirate, your fate was sealed. But if you were a pregnant pirate, suddenly things got weirdly merciful. Welcome to the world of pleading the belly. A phrase that sounds like someone's trying to get out of gym class, but was actually a legal defense rooted in English common law. The idea was simple. Executing a pregnant woman would be killing an innocent life, and even 1700s justice systems knew that was a bad look. So when a female pirate stood trial, all she had to do was claim she was with child. She didn't need proof right away. Just enough confidence to trigger the delay. The court would then appoint a panel of women called a jury of matrons, whose job was to examine the prisoner and declare, often with minimal training and maximum awkwardness, whether she was telling the truth. The science was, let's say, imprecise. If you burped too confidently, you might get off. If you looked too thin, you might hang anyway. Some pirates were actually pregnant, others were clearly bluffing, stuffing their shirts with rags or oranges, or simply crossing their fingers and hoping the matrons were half-blind or extremely charitable. But once the plea worked, it bought time, months, sometimes years, and time in prison wasn't always a death sentence. It was a chance for some that meant escape for others. It meant hoping public interest faded, or that a pardon arrived, or that a bribe made its way into the right powdered wig. Judges, for their part, were often annoyed. They didn't enjoy being outwitted by pirates, let alone pregnant pirates who rolled into their courtroom with sass and legal loopholes. But the law was the law, even if the accused had once burned a merchant ship for fun. If she had a baby on board, the court had to wait. It was piracy meets technicality, a standoff between justice and reproduction, and somehow reproduction won more often than expected. So while most male pirates met a swift and swinging end, some female pirates lived longer, not because they were innocent, but because they were either very pregnant or very persuasive. Either way, it worked, and the court, red-faced and flustered, was left muttering, "She pleads the belly again." Once the courtroom drama ended and the execution was either delayed or avoided entirely, authorities had to answer an even more awkward question. Now what, you couldn't just let a female pirate walk away. She'd be back at sea faster than you could say, "Where's my ship?" But you also couldn't toss her into a regular prison without causing a complete scandal. After all, most prisons were designed for men who stole chickens, not for women who stormed merchant vessels and stabbed officers. And so began the awkward dance of pirate storage. Female pirates were often placed in makeshift holding cells, converted rooms and forts, abandoned houses, or if things were really dire, chained up somewhere. Nobody wanted to be like a damp cellar under a governor's office. These were not glamorous accommodations. Think less. Pirates of the Caribbean. More bad Airbnb in hell. Sometimes they were locked up with other women that led to moral panic. Because what if they spread their pirate ideas like a virus? What if the other women caught ambition? In other cases, they were held completely alone under tighter security than actual murderers. Why? Because they were scary, not just for their crimes, but because they had already broken the biggest unwritten rule of the time: being a woman who didn't care what men thought. Prison guards often didn't know how to handle them. Do you treat her like a lady? Like a criminal? Like an unpredictable force of nature with a sailor's vocabulary and a dagger hidden somewhere unpleasant? There were no training manuals for that. And if the female pirate was famous, things got worse. Locals would gather to gawk newspapers printed lurid headlines, and some guards started taking bribes to let in spectators. Yes, people paid to look at the pirate lady history's first true crime sideshow. But in the long term, prison was a gamble. Conditions were appalling, disease was everywhere. Medical care was essentially, here's a bucket. Good luck, some pirates died quietly. Others lingered, growing older, angrier, and more forgotten with every passing year. Still, it beat the gallows barely when authorities didn't know what to do with a captured female pirate. And prison was full inconvenient or just too messy. They sometimes turned to the most baffling solution of all: marriage. Yes, really. Instead of executing or indefinitely imprisoning a woman who had spent years plundering ships, governments occasionally decided, you know what might solve this? A husband. Because nothing says justice, quite like handing a convicted pirate over to some poor man who thought he was just in town to buy sugar. The logic, if we can call it that, was that matrimony would civilize her. Surely once shackled to a boring husband and an even more boring domestic life, the pirate spark would fizzle out a few years of laundry babies and passive-aggressive dinner conversations, and voila, problem solved. Some female pirates accepted this fate possibly out of survival instinct. Others saw it as the ultimate undercover mission. They went from swinging cutlasses to stirring porridge, all while quietly avoiding execution. Of course, this plan occasionally backfired. Some women used marriage as a launchpad for a new life of subtle rebellion. They kept weapons hidden in kitchens. They gave their children suspiciously nautical names. And let's be honest, once you've commanded a ship and stared down naval cannons, it's hard to get excited about sewing curtains. There were also cases where women chose marriage as part of their legal bargain. A pirate might agree to testify against her crew in exchange for freedom and a sanctioned relationship. The courts, eager to sweep everything under the rug, often accepted after all. If she was off the seas and barefoot in a garden somewhere, the problem was technically gone. Sometimes she married another pirate because nothing says romance like mutual felony. But this solution also tells us something deeper about how authorities viewed women, criminals. They didn't want justice. They wanted control. And what better way to contain a wild woman than by assigning her to a man? It was parole by proposal, amnesia by apron. And though it worked in a few cases, many of these women remained pirates in spirit, just with better disguises. If you thought today's media thrived on scandal, you should have seen the 18th century version when a female pirate was captured, tried, or even rumored to exist. The pamphlets flew faster than cannonballs. Newspapers, broadsheets, and gossip rags had a field day. They printed tales of she-wolves of the sea, the corset-clad cutthroats and harlots with hatchets. Some stories were based on real events, most were not. But accuracy was never the goal. Sales where female pirates became instant tabloid celebrities. Their trials turned into theatrical spectacles with audiences lining up. Not because they cared about justice, but because they wanted to see a woman who drank rum, carried pistols, and talked back to authority. Preferably all at once. Some publications painted them as tragic figures led astray by bad men and rum-soaked temptation. Others leaned hard into horror, describing them as bloodthirsty monsters who stabbed men just for fun, or worse, dressed like sailors. The horror. This public fascination created a strange dilemma for the courts. If they executed her, they risked martyring her. If they spared her, they looked weak either way. They couldn't win, especially when every outcome was being printed and sold on every street corner for a penny. Authorities hated this attention. They didn't like their trials turning into soap operas. Female pirates refused to fit into neat legal categories. Worse, they talked, some gave witty testimonies, others mocked the judges. A few made biting political remarks that probably had courtroom scribes quietly choking on their ink, and the public ate it up in some cases. This unexpected celebrity status actually helped a woman pirate with enough public sympathy or curiosity might get a lighter sentence simply because the authorities wanted to avoid backlash. Executing her might trigger outrage, or worse, inspire copycats. Of course not. Everyone was lucky. Fame could turn quickly. One bad headline and you went from misunderstood rebel to spawn of Satan with a saber. But the bigger point is this. Even in a time before Instagram, female pirates understood the value of controlling the narrative. They made headlines, they sold papers, and sometimes they talked their way into survival. For every Anne Bonny or Ching Shear who made it into books, ballads, and badly researched Halloween costumes, there were dozens, maybe hundreds of female pirates whose names were never recorded, whose trials were never written down, and whose fates were quietly buried under layers of dust and disinterest. You see, history is picky. It remembers the flamboyant, the loud, the unignorable, but many captured female pirates weren't legends. They were just people, sailors, wives who turned pirate to survive, tavern girls who hopped aboard a ship and found they were better at stabbing than serving. Some might have only joined for the adventure. Others were born into it. But once caught, they didn't get headlines. They got forgotten. Why? Because they didn't fit the narrative. Authorities wanted female criminals to be cautionary tales. Not complicated if a woman was too fierce. She became a monster too quiet. She vanished from record. Most were shoved into unmarked graves, dismissed as nameless wenches, and left out of the official story, because frankly, they made the men in charge. Uncomfortable prison logs mention a woman taken at sea. Without elaboration, court records refer to a female accomplice as if being unnamed somehow made her less real. And since literacy wasn't universal, and women weren't encouraged to write memoirs or write anything at all, their stories died with them. Some might have died in prison. Others might have been sold into labor or quietly executed without trial. A few may have escaped, slipping away into anonymity, maybe starting a life in land where no one asked too many questions about sword scars and nautical tattoos. But their silence is a different kind of legacy, one built not on fame but erasure. They were inconvenient. They disrupted neat history, and so they were swept under the rug like evidence at a royal scandal. Yet even if we don't know their names, their existence mattered. Every one of them was a breach in the wall, a reminder that women didn't just live in history, they fought in it, bled in it, and sometimes even steered it. They may not have made it into the spotlight, but they were there just off stage, cut from the script. And that, ironically, makes them the most pirate-like of all. So let's say the court didn't hang her, didn't imprison her for life, and didn't marry her off, like some bizarre state-sponsored dating show. What, then why reform her? Of course, after all, society couldn't just leave a former pirate to roam free. That would be dangerous. She might read, or worse, inspire other women to stop obeying. So the next best thing, turn her into a proper lady. Yes, rehabilitation, 18th century style. The plan was simple. Take this blood-soaked, ocean-hardened woman who once commanded men in cannon fire and teach her embroidery, because nothing cures a history of violent maritime theft, quite like cross-stitching a decorative pillow. Some women were placed in convents, others were sent to homes for fallen women, which is a delicate way of saying state, affumed guilt traps with terrible food. There they were encouraged, often, forced to repent, reform, and reflect on their sins, ideally while wearing gray religious instruction. Played a big part. The thinking was, sure, she's robbed 30 ships and possibly murdered someone with a table leg, but if she memorizes the Lord's Prayer, she's basically fixed. In some cases, it worked in others. The pirate in question politely nodded her way through the sermon while planning her exit strategy. And let's not pretend this was ever about redemption. It was about image. Governments didn't want these women back on ships or in taverns, telling stories about how they once stole a Spanish galleon with nothing but nerve and a dirty joke. They wanted them invisible, harmless, and ideally silent. So reform became a way to contain the problem, to fold female pirates back into the safe, obedient mold of womanhood. Bake bread, mend clothes. Forget you once led a mutiny. But the pirate spirit isn't easily tamed. Some reformed women quietly returned to sea, changed their names and kept going. Others married and ran their homes like ships structured loud and possibly armed. As it turns out, some female pirates didn't need to plead the belly fake a marriage or learn to crochet. They just needed to talk loudly and about everyone. Welcome to the less glamorous but highly effective route out of execution. Snitching authorities were always desperate for information. They didn't just want pirates caught. They wanted networks dismantled, routes uncovered, and ships seized, so when a captured woman offered to spill names, locations, and where Captain so-and-so kept his loot ears perked up. And let's be honest, some of these women had dirt. They'd sailed with crews of cutthroats, overheard plans over spilled rum, and knew which harbors turned a blind eye on Thursdays. Their memories, suddenly very sharp, under threat of hanging, became priceless. In exchange, pardons, reduced sentences, or at the very least, a delayed execution and a slightly less rat-infested cell. Now don't mistake this for cowardice. Snitching wasn't always easy. Pirate codes, especially among the Caribbean crews, treated informants like garbage fire. But when you're staring down the hangman and he's already checking the knot, tension, loyalty becomes negotiable. Some women use this tactic to buy time. Others used it to walk free. A few even turned it into full-time work, assisting naval intelligence in hunting down their former friends. You haven't seen drama until a woman who once led a mutiny is now in a courtroom, casually giving directions to her exipmates. Hide out cold. May be effective extremely. But here's the twist. Some of these informants lied or at least exaggerated. They'd name people who were already dead, invent entire smuggling networks, or claim they once shared a dinghy with Blackbeard's ghost. The authorities, often too, bureaucratic to Dublich. Check. Ate it up. Did it always work? No. Some women still got executed after giving everything they knew, but others walked away scot-free, probably laughing all the way back to a quiet coastal village where no one knew. They once threatened a Spanish captain with a hot poker. Turning informant was the ultimate pirate pivot. Less heroic, more strategic, less cutlass, more clipboard. Not every female pirate escaped the noose. For every Anne Bonny who pled her belly, or Chingshire who out-negotiated an empire, there were others who reached the end of the rope, literally. And when they did, it wasn't quiet. Public executions were 18th century Netflix crowds gathered in droves, peasants, nobles, street vendors, children with questionable parenting. All came to watch a spectacle, the final act of a pirate's life, and preferably one that involved last words, dramatic eye contact, and something poetic about sin and the sea. But a woman being hanged in public, that was a whole other level of cultural fascination. It was scandalous. It was taboo. It was unfortunately great, for ticket sales authorities often saw these moments as opportunities, moral lessons dressed up in gallows ropes. See what happens when women disobey. The state seemed to say, this is what comes from trousers rum and too much independence, and yet the crowd didn't always play along. Some female pirates won over the audience with a sharp tongue or sheer defiance. They'd climb the scaffold without flinching, offer biting words too, about gender, and neither did the gunpowder. Only the people writing the judges below or wink at the executioner just to make him nervous. One even reportedly scolded the priest for being boring during her last rites. Iconic others wept, cried for mercy, sang hymns. Some said nothing at all, silent to the bitter end. But whatever their reaction, it became part of the public record. The newspaper boys were already scribbling it down for tomorrow's scandal. Sheet Lady Pirates' last curse before the drop. The state sometimes tried to stage manage these deaths, hoping to send a message, but messages are funny things. Sometimes the only thing people took away was admiration, especially when the condemned looked dignified, clever, or simply braver than the powdered men watching from the balcony. And here lies the paradox: female pirates were executed to erase them. But the drama of their deaths often made them unforgettable. It didn't matter that they died. What mattered was how they died. And many did so with a middle finger to the very world that couldn't decide whether to fear them, pity them, or pretend they'd never existed at all. Death was never the end for a good pirate. Not when there were ballads to be written, myths to be inflated, and history books desperately trying to turn women into metaphors after a female pirate's capture. Whether she was hanged, imprisoned, or mysteriously disappeared into retirement, her story usually didn't stop. Instead, it got rewritten. Not by her, of course, but by men, mostly men with quills, questionable motives, and an unhealthy addiction to moral lessons. Writers took these women and reshaped them like clay. If she died young, she was a tragic seductress. If she survived, she was a cautionary tale. If she outsmarted the system, she was either a freak or a fraud. Nuance never heard of it over time. Actual facts got buried under layers of narrative glitter. Anne Bonny became a wild redhead with a cutlass in one hand and a rum bottle in the other. Mary Red was turned into her loyal sidekick. Chingesh became a caricature of exotic danger, and countless other women were compressed into the same tired headline. She dressed as a man, as if trousers were the real crime. And of course, for the pirates who escaped record entirely, their stories were absorbed into folklore. Anonymous pirate queens popped up in poems and pulp novels, often bearing suspiciously familiar traits, vengeful, seductive, and inevitably punished. Apparently, the only thing worse than a woman with a sword was a woman with a happy ending. But sometimes these stories backfired as the centuries passed. Readers stopped seeing female pirates as cautionary tales and started seeing them as icons, rebellious, independent, terrifying. In all the right ways, the same narratives meant to scare people into obedience instead inspired them to ask, wait, why weren't there more of them? And that's the legacy these women in life were hunted, tried, and punished in death. They were twisted, sensationalized, or erased. But in legend, they thrived. They became symbols of defiance. Messy, complicated, gloriously inconvenient reminders that women didn't just exist in history. They rattled its bones after hearing the stories of Bonny Red and Chingish. You might wonder, why weren't there more female pirates? Were there really so few? Or were they simply never allowed to be remembered? Short answer, sexism. Longer answer, institutional, cultural, maritime, legal, and logistical sexism with a generous sprinkling of fragile masculinity and body odor. For one thing, ships were overwhelmingly male. Space's many navies and private crews outright banned women on board, citing superstition, bad luck, and the age-old belief that if a woman joined a voyage, everyone would get distracted and crash into a rock. Apparently, centuries of navigation training could be undone by a pair of hips. Women who did sail often had to disguise themselves: trousers, scarves, flattened chests, deep voices. They lived double lives just to be allowed on deck, and if discovered they weren't applauded, they were often thrown overboard. Or worse. This wasn't a world that tolerated female ambition, let alone female violence, even in the criminal underworld. Misogyny held fast. Male pirates could be grotesque murderers and still gain nicknames, songs, and sympathetic biographies. A woman pirate, meanwhile, was either a seductress, a fluke, or the embodiment of unnatural evil. There was no middle ground, and when women were caught, their stories were filtered through the same narrow lens. Officials wrote them off as camp followers, wives of pirates, or simply mistakes. Their crimes weren't taken seriously, but their existence was treated like an insult. So, yes, there were likely more female pirates than we know, but they didn't get the headlines. They didn't get the trials. They didn't get the ballads. They got footnotes, or worse, silence that eraser wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. History prefers its rebels to be predictable. And there's nothing predictable about a woman with a cutlass, a crew, and absolutely no intention of making anyone comfortable. The few who made it into the history books were the loudest, boldest, or most difficult to ignore. The rest, they vanished into the fog of unnamed sailors buried under the assumption that piracy was a boy club. But let's be clear, the sea didn't care. Records did. So what did happen to female pirates after capture? Well, some were hanged, some died in prison, some got married, some pled pregnancy, a few talked their way out, one negotiated a retirement package that would make any CEO weep with envy, and most were forgotten. But the real story isn't just about what happened to them after capture. It's what their captures reveal about the world around them, a world that found women with swords more terrifying than entire armadas. These were women who defied expectations, geography, law, and fashion norms. They boarded ships when society told them to stay home. They killed when told to be kind. They led when told to follow. And when they were finally cornered, society didn't just punish them for piracy. It punished them for existing outside the roles assigned to them. Every response to their capture, whether it was execution, imprisonment, forced reform, or convenient historical amnesia, reflects less about their crimes and more about the deep discomfort they caused. Not because they were pirates, but because they were women who refused to behave. Their stories, varied and incomplete, still managed to disrupt tidy narratives. They force us to look beyond the caricatures of history and into the faces of real people who were complicated, clever, angry, resourceful, and sometimes very, very tired. And yes, they were criminals. Let's not romanticize murder and theft just because someone wore a cool hat while doing it. But let's also not pretend the men they sailed with were saints either. The only difference, the men were expected to be violent, the women weren't. That's what made them dangerous. So what happened to female pirates after capture? They were punished. They were erased. They were repackaged as cautionary tales, and then, centuries later, they were resurrected. They remind us that history isn't just written by the victors. Sometimes it's rewritten by the survivors, and sometimes the loudest echo in history isn't the canon. It's the voice of someone who was never supposed to speak. Let's start with the birthplace of civilization, and possibly the birthplace of the hangover ancient Sumer picture. This 4,000 years ago in the sweltering city of Ur. You're not sipping coffee or juice with breakfast. Nope. You're guzzling a clay cup full of warm, cloudy beer, thick enough to chew on and nutritious enough to count as a meal. The Sumerians called it Cass, but it was less IPA with citrus notes and more fermented barley sludge. And believe it or not, it was sacred. They didn't just drink beer, they worshipped it. Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, had her own hymn that doubled as a recipe. The lyrics were something like, "You are the one who soaks the malt in a jar. You are the one who spreads the cooked mash." You get the idea. Yeast and divine intervention. Did the rest beer in Summa. Wasn't for parties. It was for life. Everyone drank it. Priests, farmers, women, children. It was safer than the water, easier to make than wine, and kept you just buzzed enough to forget how many taxes the temple just levied on your grain. Even more bizarre beer was currency workers got paid in it, sometimes up to 5 liters a day. Imagine clocking out after a hard day of hauling bricks for a ziggurat, and your boss hands you a paycheck. You can literally drink you'd toast to the gods, then promptly pass out. And speaking of gods, temples weren't just places of worship. They were industrial breweries. High priests oversaw production with holy fervor. Brew mistresses, yes. Women-dominated brewing crafted the divine drink in massive clay vats, their hands stained with barley mash and maybe a little ego. They drank it communally, with long reed straws plunged into massive jars. Not for sipping aesthetics, but to filter out the chunks. It was gritty, warm, and absolutely sacred. But perhaps most importantly, Sumerian beer shows us something profound. Fermentation wasn't just about intoxication, it was a survival strategy. It sterilized water, extended grain stores, and created a culture where drunkenness wasn't shameful. It was expected. If the Sumerians gave beer its soul, the Egyptians gave it swagger in ancient Egypt. Beer wasn't just a drink. It was practically a food group brewed from emmetan barley, often flavored with dates or herbs. It was thick, sweet, and loaded with calories. Not quite a lager, not quite a smoothie. Imagine if oatmeal decided to party from pyramid workers to pharaohs. Everyone drank beer. Tomb inscriptions show laborers were routinely given daily rations of bread, onions, and beer, a classic lunch combo. If you liked your carbs with a side of hallucinations, the belief was simple beer sustained. Life built monuments, and maybe made moving. 2.5-ton limestone blocks, slightly less soul-crushing. Even the gods were fond of the brew. The goddess Hathor, who doubled as the deity of music. Joy and tipsy dancing was also Egypt's original barmaid, but it was Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and wrath, who had a legendary drinking problem, one that may have saved humanity. According to myth, Sekhmet got a bit too enthusiastic about punishing humans, and went on a divine rampage to stop her. Ra tricked her by dyeing thousands of jugs of beer red and pouring them across the fields to resemble blood. Sekhmet, thinking it was the real deal, drank it all. She passed out in a blissful booze-induced nap, and humanity survived, all thanks to one hell of a beer. Run temples in Egypt also took beer seriously. Some had their own breweries, and the drink was often used as an offering to the gods or the dead. You didn't want to enter the afterlife empty-handed. That was just poor planning. A few jars of beer tucked into your tomb, and you were ready for eternity with a respectable buzz. Interestingly, beer was considered a woman's craft. Brewing was done primarily by women, often in the home, and some rose to hold official titles like Mistress of the House of Beer. So yes, ancient Egypt had beer ladies before it had pyramids. In the end, Egyptian beer was more than just a beverage. It was a symbol of fertility, vitality, and divine favor. And if Sekhmet's story is any clue, it could also stop the apocalypse. one hangover at a time. If Sumer and Egypt worshipped beer, the ancient Greeks practically made wine their national identity. In fact, they'd probably look at beer the way we look at gas station, sushi, suspicious and vaguely barbaric. To a Greek, real civilization began with fermented grapes, and a well-structured toast wine in Greece wasn't just a drink, it was an intellectual lubricant. And where did all that lubricated intellect go? Straight into the symposium, a boozy, all-male drinking party that was part frat house, part TED Talk, and part late-night therapy session. Picture a bunch of tunic-clad philosophers reclining on couches sipping diluted wine from ceramic cups, debating the nature of love, the cosmos, and occasionally who stole whose goat, and yes, diluted. The Greeks almost never drank their wine straight. To do so was considered barbaric, a sign you were probably a Therian warlord or had serious boundary issues. The proper mix was about 1 part wine to 3 parts water, just enough to keep you sharp and a little dramatic. Presiding over the whole event was the symposia, basically the party planner, wine cop. He decided the dilution ratio, pace of drinking, and sometimes even the night's philosophical theme. Think Socrates meets a modern DJ, but with more moralizing and fewer lasers. Wine wasn't just for parties, though. It was medicinal, sacred, and symbolic. Doctors like Hippocrates prescribed it for everything from digestive issues to melancholy dines. The god of wine, madness, and ecstasy embodied both the pleasure and the danger of the drink. Worshipping him could involve song, dance, trance, or total blackout, and like all things, Greek wine had its class rules. The wealthy drank aged vintages from imported emporia with servants constantly refilling their kylixes. The poor, they got the dregs, cheap, sharp, and best consumed with a slice of humble pie. Still, for the Greeks, wine was the golden thread that tied together the sacred and the profane. It was poured out as libations to the gods before every meal. It accompanied oaths, sacrifices, marriages, funerals, and awkward declarations of love to your best friend's husband's cousin. Wine didn't just make you tipsy, it made you Greek. The Romans didn't invent wine, but they absolutely weaponized it to them. Wine wasn't just a pleasure, it was propaganda. It was Roman civilization in liquid form. If you drank wine, you were cultured. If you didn't, you were a barbarian. And if you drank too much, well, you were probably still a senator. Roman vineyards sprawled across the empire from the hills of Italy to the rocky soil of Gaul. Wine was so essential that legionnaires were given rations of it alongside bread and olive oil. This wasn't just generosity, it was strategy. A buzzed soldier was a loyal soldier, or at least less likely to mutiny before lunch. But it wasn't all war and vineyard logistics. Enter Bakes, the Roman god of wine, ecstasy, and questionable decisions his worship involved. Bacchanalia, wild, secretive festivals filled with drinking, dancing, and a suspicious lack of toga. These parties started as religious rites and quickly turned into the ancient world's most exclusive raves, that is, until the Roman Senate got nervous and banned them in 186 BCE. Apparently too many senators were waking up in fountains. Still, the love of wine was hard to kill. Rome even classified wines like modern sums. They knew which vintage came from which region and how long it had aged in an amphora. The most prized Fermina, a strong, sweet wine from Campa. Basically the Dom Perignon of its day, minus the corks. And just like today, Roman wine had its class divisions. The elites drank refined wines, often cut with honey herbs, or even seawater for that extra tang. The poor made do with labra, a thin vinegary sludge made from rehydrated grapes, the ancient equivalent of boxed wine mixed with regret. But wine wasn't just consumed. It was politics. Emperors like Augustus used it to show moderation and piety, while others looking at you. Nero and Caligula turned their dinner parties into full-blown theatrical catastrophes. If your emperor started mixing wine with powdered pearls or poisoning guests, things were probably heading downhill in Rome. Wine was everywhere, at triumphs, funerals, sacrifices, and even baby showers. If you squint hard enough, it fueled ambition, soothed defeat, and occasionally drowned an empire's moral compass in vino veritas. They said in wine truth, or at the very least plausible deniability. While the Greeks and Romans were swirling wine in painted cups and quoting philosophy, the Celts were chugging golden me from drinking horns the size of a toddler. And honestly, they seemed to be having a lot more fun mead. That ancient blend of honey water and wild yeast was the drink of choice for Celtic tribes across Gaul, the British Isles, and into what's now Germany, sweet, potent, and glowing like sunlight in a cup. It was the nectar of warriors and druids alike. Unlike wine, which had a whiff of urban sophistication, me was raw, primal, and deeply entwined with nature and magic. To the Celts, drinking wasn't just a pastime, it was a full-contact sport. Feasts or symbol were held in wooden halls where warriors boasted of past glories, recited poetry, and occasionally started brawls over seating arrangements. The me would flow freely, often poured by a woman of status, known as the megamere, who wasn't just handing out drinks, she was bestowing honor and hierarchy. One sip could elevate your reputation or end your evening with a black eye and no trousers. And then there were the druids, the bearded mystics who allegedly used me in their rituals. Me was believed to open the mind to divine inspiration, especially after the third cup. It was associated with fertility prophecy, and maybe hallucinating that your cow was speaking Latin. Even burial customs reflected this sacred buzz. Archaeological digs have uncovered cauldrons and drinking vessels buried with high-status individuals, many still containing traces of fermented honey or grain. Because apparently even in the afterlife, a Celt wasn't going to be caught sober. But me wasn't the only option. Beer too was common, often spiced with herbs like heather, bog, myrtle, or yarrow, which added flavor. Mild psychoactive effects and the occasional forest hallucination wine was imported, but only as a luxury item for chiefs and kings trying to show off to Roman envoys. If the salts turned me into a rowdy ritual, the Norse practically turned it into a cosmic contract for the Vikings. Alcohol wasn't just for feasting. It was part of the afterlife divine warfare and occasionally poetic inspiration from the spit of gods. Yes, really. Let's start with me of poetry, a mythical brew made from the blood and saliva of a murdered wise man. According to Nesmith, the gods accidentally created this me, then immediately realized they had liquid wisdom on their hands. Anyone who drank it could compose epic poetry, or more likely, deliver passionate drunk ramblings that rhymed the Norse, believed that when you died heroically, you didn't go to a cloudy heaven or a cozy underworld. You went to Valhalla, there in Odin's grand hall. You drank endless mead, served by Valkyries fought, all day, died gloriously resurrected, and did it all again, like a violent, eternal Oktoberfest. This heavenly me. It came from the udders of a mythical goat named Hydron, who stood on the roof of Valhalla and somehow produced a daily supply of honeyed ambrosia. It's unclear what this goat ate or how the physics worked, but no one questioned it. Not when the buzz was that good. Back on Earth, Norseman halls were the center of social and political life. Chiefs threw elaborate feasts not just for fun, but to show dominance, form alliances, and keep warriors loyal. Drinking was a performance. Toasts were made to the gods, the ancestors and fallen comrades' scolds. Norse poets recited sagas fueled by liquid courage and probably a few exaggerated memories. Drinking horns were prized possessions, often decorated with silver runes and dragon motifs, and like everything Norse, they came with rules. If someone offered you a horn, you drank. Refusal was an insult that could end in a duel, or at the very least an awkward silence, followed by axe throwing, unlike Roman wine or Egyptian beer. Norse alcohol didn't strive for refinement. It was rugged, symbolic, and often strong enough to blur the line between man and myth. Mead was consumed before battle, after victories, during weddings, and at funerals, sometimes all in the same week. Wine from Campa. Basically, the dumb pair. Some say that wine mixed with exhaustion and perhaps poison led to his death at the age of 32. Others say the real poison was thinking while the West was busy with barley brews, and poetic me ancient China was quietly perfecting the science and ceremony of alcohol. The Chinese didn't just drink. They turned it into an art form, a religious tool, and sometimes a high-stakes drinking game that decided political careers. Let's start with Ju, a general term for alcoholic drinks ranging from weak rice beers to powerful grain-based liquors. The earliest known Chinese alcohol was fermented from rice honey and fruit, as far back as 7000 BCE, which means while Sumerians were still figuring out irrigation, the Chinese were already brewing cocktails. But alcohol in ancient China wasn't about getting sloshed for sport. It was about balance, harmony, and timing. In Confucian thought, moderation was everything. You could enjoy a drink, but if you got sloppy at a banquet, you weren't just embarrassing yourself, you were disrupting the moral order of the universe. So, no pressure rituals were at the heart of Chinese drinking culture. Alcohol was poured as offerings to ancestors to heaven and earth, and at state ceremonies. Emperors hosted elaborate banquets where ministers were expected to drink, but not too much. One wrong toast, and you might wake up unemployed or exiled. And then there were the drinking games. Oh yes. Ancient Chinese banquets weren't all chopsticks and poetry. They played games with dice riddles and even spinning arrows to determine who would drink next. Loser chugs. Winner also chugs. It was less about winning and more about surviving without offending anyone's honor. Poets and scholars elevated alcohol into muse. Fuel Lai, the legendary Tang Dynasty poet, famously wrote his best verses while drunk. Sometimes while trying to embrace the moon's reflection in a river, he once claimed that a pot of wine among the flowers was all he needed to feel the universe open up to be fair. We've all had that one poetic moment after 3 shots of baijiu. The alcohol itself evolved too, from cloudy rice wines to clear distilled spirits like Hengel and Bale, the latter being so potent it could sterilize a battlefield wound or create one if shared too freely, while other civilizations drank to party. The ancient Indians may have been sipping their way to enlightenment, or at least trying to enter Soma, one of the most mysterious and mythically loaded drinks in human history. Was it wine? A mushroom-fermented plant juice? No one really knows. What we do know is that it was sacred and strong, mentioned over 100 times in the Rig Veda. The oldest of the Vedic texts, S wasn't just a beverage, it was a god, a living, breathing deity you could drink. According to the hymns, S flowed in a golden stream, rushed like a stallion, and made the drinker feel immortal. You know the usual symptoms of too much ancient chemistry. S was consumed by priests during fire rituals and sacrifices, its effects believed to bring clarity, divine vision, and possibly some epic hallucinations. The drink was pressed from an unknown plant mixed with milk or water filtered through wool and offered to the gods before being consumed by the humans. Talk about a divine chain of custody. The priests claimed that after drinking S, they could commune with Indra, the thunder god, and even see the heavens split open. Whether that was actual communion or just early psychedelic microdoing is still up for debate, but not everyone was allowed to chug the sacred stuff, as was restricted to brains and ritual specialists, a kind of priestly happy hour with cosmic consequences. No casual sipping here drinking was an act of spiritual elevation, not social lubrication. Eventually, the original soma plant disappeared, either lost to time, climate change, or someone accidentally eating the last patch during a vision quest. Later texts like the Avda referred to more metaphorically as the elixir of life or the nectar of the gods. Some scholars believe that Amrite, the drink of immortality in Hindu mythology, is its evolution, a spiritualized version of the old divine cocktail. Even today, the mystery of soma fascinates historians, botanists, and mystics alike. Was it a hallucinogenic mushroom, a fermented milkweed, something now extinct? Whatever it was, its effects were profound enough to shape an entire religious worldview across ancient civilizations. Alcohol was sacred, medicinal, social, and sometimes utterly catastrophic for every priest singing hymns over a sacred brew. There was a king somewhere chugging himself straight into chaos, because while fermentation could build empires, it also had a bad habit of unseating the people in charge. Take Alexander the Great, conqueror of most of the known world, sure, but also a notorious binge drinker who once downed a massive bowl of unmixed wine in a contest and never recovered. You could outdrink your own troops in China during the Shang dynasty. King Xin was infamous for his lake of wine and forest of meat, a literal lake filled with alcohol surrounded by trees, hung with roasted animals. He invited guests to drink until they fell in, which honestly sounds like the world's deadliest pool party spoiler. The dynasty collapsed soon after shocking. And let's not forget the Roman emperors. Caligula mixed wine with madness. Nero, during his theatrical dinners, drank until he wept often for himself. Commodes, who fancied himself Hercules reincarnated, was known to drink and brawl in the arena. All of them saw their reigns descend into cruelty, paranoia, and very public meltdowns, often fueled by fermented grapes and a profound misunderstanding of moderation. Even the Norse sagas warned of kings who drank too deeply. A drunken ruler couldn't hear the gods lead in battle or even stay upright at a feast, and in a culture where honor meant everything. Slurring your words in front of your warriors was not just embarrassing. It was disqualifying. Ancient texts across cultures warned against excessive drinking. Confucius preached restraint. Vedic hymns warned of spiritual distraction. Even the Greeks, for all their wine worship, drew the line at public drunkenness. It wasn't the alcohol that was the problem. It was the loss of control the moment the cup ruled the king. Everything else started to fall apart in ancient Egypt. Dogs weren't just companions. They were sacred symbols, status symbols, and sometimes even divine intermediaries. Forget chasing sticks in the backyard. These dogs lounged in palaces, attended royal hunts, and were buried in tombs with more ceremony than most humans. Pharaohs and nobles adored their canine companions. Greyhounds were particularly prized for their sleek form and hunting prowess. These weren't scrappy village, they were regal, pampered animals with names like Reliable Brave One and North Wind, actual names found etched into tomb walls. Some were given titles, jewelry, and personal attendants. In a way, they were both pets and minor celebrities in the royal court. Dogs were also deeply tied to religion. The jackal, Egypt's most dog-like creature, was associated with Anubis, the god of embalming and the underworld. He wasn't just some ominous figure lurking around pyramids. Anubis was a protector guiding souls through the afterlife. Many believed dogs, by extension, shared this guiding power. That's why they weren't just buried with their owners. They were sometimes mummified themselves, complete with tiny sarcophagi inscriptions and even painted masks. And it wasn't just the elite who kept dogs' archaeological evidence from workmen's villages and rural homes. shows that common Egyptians also had dogs. Some homes had kennels, and others featured murals depicting playful pets beneath dining tables. Proof that even 3,000 years ago people were sneaking scraps to the dog under the table. One of the most striking testaments to Egypt's love for dogs came in the form of grief in the tomb of a nobleman named Inf. Inscriptions mourned his loyal hound, Baikai. The text praises the dog's loyalty, hunting skills, and gentle nature, as if writing a eulogy for a fallen comrade. It's not hard to imagine Inf clutching a wine jar, getting misty-eyed over his old hunting partner. By the time of the New Kingdom, dogs had firmly established themselves not only in Egyptian homes, but in Egyptian hearts. They weren't just tools for hunting or symbols of wealth. They were family. If dogs had status in ancient Egypt, cats had divinity. These feline companions weren't just adored. They were worshipped in a society where order, balance, and protection were sacred. The cat embodied all three: sleek, poised, deadly to vermin, and yet mysteriously aloof. It's no wonder ancient Egyptians looked at cats and saw magic. At the heart of feline adoration was the goddess Bastet, initially a fierce lionist deity. Bastet eventually softened into the sleek domestic cat goddess associated with home fertility music and protection. Her temples, especially the grand one in Bubastis, were filled with worshippers offering food trinkets and incredibly mummified cats. Lots of them, thousands upon thousands, lovingly wrapped and buried like royalty. Imagine an ancient pet cemetery the size of a small town, but cats weren't just sacred in temples. They were deeply woven into daily life. They kept granaries free of mice and homes free of snakes. More importantly, they became treasured household companions. Tomb paintings show women holding cats like children, petting them during meals or letting them lounge beneath chairs at banquets. Some cats even wore decorative collars and golden earrings. That's right. Ancient blinged-out cats roamed the halls of nobles' homes like furry fashion models. The bond between cat and human was so strong that harming a cat even accidentally could bring serious punishment. Sometimes even death. Killing a cat, even by mistake, was a capital crime. That's not a metaphor, that's written law. When a